You ever wonder what it really meant to fight in a medieval war? Not from the view of kings or knights in shining armor, but the poor souls stuck with the worst jobs imaginable? No glory, no songs written about them, just cold steel, mud, and almost certain death. In this video, we're digging into the scariest jobs on a medieval battlefield. We're not talking about the guys who got to swing swords from horseback. We're looking at the ones who were first to die, the ones buried alive, the ones who went into battle knowing they weren't expected to come back. From the men forced to walk into enemy fire with nothing but a wooden shield, to those digging tunnels underneath castles while praying the ground didn't collapse on them, this is the brutal, unfiltered side of medieval warfare you don't see in movies. And yeah, some of these roles sound insane today, but back then, they were just part of war. Let's break it all down and take a closer look at what it meant to have the worst job on the battlefield. Number 1. The poor bastard called the vanguard. The vanguard wasn't some ceremonial position or symbol of honor. It was a death sentence with a job description. In any medieval army formation, the vanguard stood at the very front of the line, and that meant being the first to face everything the enemy could throw. This wasn't an elite role. Most of these men were peasant levies, barely trained and poorly equipped. Many came straight from the fields, handed a spear and a basic helmet, and pushed toward the front like meat for the grinder. If there were archers on the opposing side, the vanguard took the arrows first. If siege weapons launched massive rocks or flaming debris, the vanguard was the one eating the impact. In castle sieges, these were the guys sent to storm the walls first, climb up ladders under boiling oil and stones, often without even the bare minimum of cover. Cavalry charges? Yeah, they'd get trampled before even reacting. The idea was brutal but simple. Their job was to soak up the chaos so the more valuable units, knights, better trained infantry, and cavalry, could see what was happening and maybe respond effectively. But by the time that happened, the vanguard was usually a pile of bodies. They were the literal testers of the battlefield. If the enemy had dug hidden trenches or set up pikes in the grass, the vanguard would be the ones to find out by falling into them or being impaled. There was no tactical feedback loop, no messenger running back with updates, just death and confusion. It wasn't that commanders didn't know they were sending men to die, they absolutely did. But they had to choose who would take the hit, and the poor, untrained footmen were always first in line. The term cannon fodder wasn't around yet, but that's exactly what they were. There were also political calculations involved. Many feudal lords were reluctant to risk their own retainers or knights early on, so expendable peasants made up the bulk of the vanguard. In rare cases where better troops led the vanguard, it was usually because morale needed a boost, or the commanders wanted to make a bold statement. But that was the exception, not the rule. It wasn't courage that put you in the vanguard, it was lack of options. No family name, no training, no coin to bribe your way into a safer position. You went up front. And the worst part is that if by some miracle you survived the initial clash, you'd still likely be pressed to keep fighting in the blood-soaked chaos that followed. Victory didn't mean safety, it meant more carnage. The vanguard bore the full psychological toll too. Walking toward the enemy knowing full well you'd probably be dead in minutes isn't something you just shake off. There were accounts of men vomiting before battles, trembling uncontrollably or trying to flee. Desertion was a problem, but if caught, it usually led to hanging or mutilation. So they stayed. Out of fear, not loyalty. And if they lived, they rarely got recognition. There were no songs about the peasant who held the line until the knights arrived. The vanguard existed to die loudly enough to give others a chance to win. It was the most thankless, terrifying role on any medieval battlefield, and one that tens of thousands had no choice but to accept. Number 2. Sappers and tunnel rats. Among the most physically and mentally punishing roles on a medieval battlefield, sappers, also called miners or tunnel rats, played a part that was both essential and invisible. These men were responsible for collapsing enemy fortifications from beneath, using crude tools like picks, shovels, and hammers, and often crawling through hand-dug tunnels barely high enough to crouch in. Their task was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Dig beneath castle walls, weaken the foundation, and bring down the structure. What made the job terrifying wasn't just the claustrophobic darkness or the physical toll, but the unpredictable danger. The enemy might hear digging and dispatch a counter squad to intercept them underground. This led to deadly tunnel skirmishes in pitch-black passages filled with dust, smoke, and the oppressive weight of silence. These fights weren't like surface battles. There was no room to swing swords, so miners used daggers, picks, or blunt tools, and often fought by feel alone. Air was limited. Torches sucked up oxygen, and fire hazards were constant, especially if defenders poured oil or smoke into the shafts. In some sieges, defenders resorted to flooding the tunnels, setting them alight or collapsing them deliberately to bury the sappers alive. Despite how essential they were to a siege's success, sappers rarely received recognition. Most were commoners paid a pittance, and once a wall came down, the credit usually went to the knights charging in afterward. But without these tunnelers, many sieges would have dragged on for months longer, or failed entirely. Some castles even had complex countermining defenses, like stone-lined foundations or deep moats, specifically to stop sappers from getting close enough to work. These obstacles forced sappers to dig longer, riskier tunnels that might take weeks to complete, and offered more opportunities for cave-ins or detection. Historical records from sieges like those at Rochester Castle or Chateau Gaillard describe extensive mining operations that nearly turned into wars within the earth. They also mention the psychological strain, digging in near silence, aware that your life could end with a single mistake, enemy ambush, or structural failure. Some tunnelers reportedly experienced hallucinations from bad air or extreme stress. And yet they kept going, because they knew their small, dark battlefield had consequences above ground. Without sappers, even the most well-equipped medieval army could be stalled indefinitely by well-built fortifications. These men weren't just diggers. They were the medieval world's version of explosive experts, laying the groundwork, literally, for every final assault. Number 3, the crossbow target, also known as pavis bearers. During the height of medieval warfare, particularly in the 13th to 15th centuries, crossbows became a dominant force on the battlefield due to their armor-piercing bolts and relatively low skill requirement for use. But they came with a serious drawback: a long reloading time. Unlike longbows, which could fire several arrows per minute, crossbows, especially the more powerful windlass or cranaquin types, required significant time and effort to reload, leaving the shooter completely exposed. To deal with this, armies developed a specific support role: the pavis bearer. These were men tasked with carrying large, often curved shields known as pavises, which could be planted into the ground to form a portable wall in front of crossbowmen during sieges or pitched battles. While this might sound like a logistical support role, in reality it was one of the most dangerous positions on the field. Pavis bearers had to move in front of the main line and stand or kneel while holding a massive shield made from wood and hide, reinforced with metal bands. And they had to do all this while volleys of arrows, bolts, and even early gunpowder weapons tore through the air. The pavis was effective only if it stayed upright, which meant the bearer couldn't just drop it and run. They needed to anchor it, brace it, and hold it even under heavy fire. If enemy cavalry managed to break through, pavis bearers were among the first to be run down. They couldn't easily defend themselves because their hands were full, and most weren't even equipped with a proper weapon. Maybe a short sword or a dagger at best. In many cases, they weren't given much armor either, making them soft targets for enemy archers. These weren't elite soldiers or well-trained guards. More often they were conscripted peasants, hired auxiliaries, or the lowest-ranking men in the company. Their job wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't optional. Someone had to stand between the crossbowmen and the incoming hail of death, and that someone wasn't going to be a knight or an officer. Their role was essential, especially in prolonged sieges where ranged exchanges could go on for hours. Pavis bearers had to remain calm, disciplined, and unmoving even when comrades were being killed right beside them. In some documented cases, they were tied to the paves to ensure they didn't retreat. What's worse, these men didn't get remembered. Chronicles spoke of brave knights, cunning generals, and legendary archers, but rarely of the silent figure crouched behind a wooden slab, absorbing punishment so someone else could fire another shot. Even in reenactments or historical studies today, their presence is often reduced to a background detail. And yet, without them, crossbow units would have been nearly unusable in open battle. In a profession already filled with risk, being the human shield for someone else, with no reward and almost certain injury or death, easily ranks among the scariest battlefield jobs in the medieval world. Number 4. Messengers in the heat of battle. Delivering a message in the middle of a medieval battlefield wasn't just another task, it was a gamble with your life every single time. The armies of the time weren't neat rows of troops with headsets or color-coded signals. Once swords clashed and arrows started flying, the noise, the movement, and the confusion were overwhelming. It became almost impossible to control anything centrally, so commanders relied on human messengers to get vital information from one part of the battlefield to another. These messengers were often on horseback, but not always, especially in tighter terrain or smaller skirmishes. The job wasn't reserved for knights or nobles, but it did require someone who was quick, calm under pressure, and smart enough to memorize exact phrasing or complex instructions on the fly. A mistake or a delay could literally cost hundreds or even thousands of lives if, say, reinforcements didn't arrive in time or a unit moved in the wrong direction. And the risks weren't limited to just getting lost or misunderstood. Battlefield messengers had to physically move through combat zones where friend and foe were mixed together chaotically. Wearing the wrong colors or armor could get you killed by your own side. Worse, if you were spotted by the enemy, they often knew what your role was, and you instantly became a priority target. These messengers weren't armed to the teeth. Their job was speed, not fighting. Being fast didn't always help if you were shot off your horse by an archer, caught in a cavalry charge, or if the terrain itself betrayed you with mud, trenches, or ditches. On top of all that, even if a messenger did manage to deliver the command in time, there was still the issue of whether or not the officer receiving the message believed it or followed it. There were plenty of cases where ego, confusion, or suspicion led to orders being ignored, and the messenger blamed for it later. In some extreme instances, messengers were executed or punished when a battle went wrong, even if the failure wasn't their fault. That's how critical and fragile their role was. The messenger was expected to remember word-for-word commands, sometimes in complicated formations, with no written record and no backup, and they had to deliver those under life-threatening conditions. In a world with no reliable long-distance communication, and where split-second timing could determine whether a siege was broken or an army was surrounded, the messenger's task was absolutely vital and terrifying. You were alone, you had no guarantee of backup, and you carried the weight of an entire strategy in your head, knowing that if you died, everything could fall apart. Number 5. Standard bearers and living targets. In medieval warfare, few roles were as psychologically draining and physically exposed as the standard bearer. This wasn't some ceremonial job for parades or morale boosters after a victory. It was a vital battlefield function and also a deadly responsibility. The standard, usually a large, colorful flag bearing the insignia of a lord, kingdom, or specific army unit, was how formations identified friend from foe and received visual commands during the chaos of war. When formations stretched across fields, hills, and smoke-covered terrain, shouted orders became useless. That's where the banner came in. It showed where your unit was regrouping, signaled when to press the attack or retreat, and most importantly, it reminded everyone that their side was still holding ground. Losing a standard in the middle of a fight could trigger panic, especially among foot soldiers who might believe their commander had fallen or the army was in retreat. So, keeping that flag upright wasn't optional, it was essential. But the man holding it was uniquely exposed. He couldn't carry a shield, since both hands were needed to grip and anchor the heavy pole, especially in wind or when moving quickly. Most standard bearers didn't have a sword either, as maneuvering it while holding the flag wasn't practical. In effect, they were battlefield markers dressed in cloth, not armor, making them prime targets for enemy archers, crossbowmen, and cavalry. Enemy forces were trained to identify and eliminate standard bearers quickly. Killing the man holding the flag could break an enemy's line without even clashing blades. Some armies assigned small protection squads to guard the standard, but even then, those squads often drew just as much attention. The psychological weight of knowing everyone could see you and everyone wanted you dead was immense. You were a priority target not because you were dangerous, but because what you represented mattered more than your life. Being a standard bearer wasn't something soldiers volunteered for. It was either assigned to those who had proven loyalty or given to someone considered expendable enough to risk. If the flag fell, someone nearby was expected to pick it up instantly, sometimes stepping over a dying comrade to do it. The longer it stayed down, the worse the panic got. In sieges and large-scale battles, multiple standards might be used for different parts of the army. That meant even in partial victories, smaller units could dissolve into chaos if they lost sight of their own colors. On horseback, it was even worse. A mounted standard bearer had to balance on an animal that could be spooked, shot, or stumble while keeping the flag visible. If thrown from the saddle, the bearer often had no chance to defend himself. The enemy recognized the vulnerability too. In battles like Agincourt or Falkirk, chronicles describe how waves of archers specifically aimed for the banners, using them as visual anchors to disrupt enemy lines. The job required visibility, and visibility meant death. There was also no blending in. A standard bearer's clothing was often deliberately bright, designed to match the banner's colors and make him easier to spot. In the fog of battle, that distinction might make the difference between rallying and rooting, but it also meant that even from hundreds of meters away, a hostile marksman knew exactly where to aim. Worse still, during routs, when an army began to flee in panic, the standard bearer couldn't just run. Dropping the banner meant failure. Keeping it upright meant being caught, surrounded, or ridden down. Many standard bearers died not in the initial clash, but during the disintegration of their own lines. Some historians argue that the role was as symbolic as it was functional, and that may be true. But in war, symbols matter. They anchor morale, coordinate movement, and remind soldiers that their unit still stands. The loss of a flag might not mean strategic defeat, but on the field it could turn the tide of human emotion, which often mattered more than tactics. The job didn't require elite combat skill, but it demanded extreme courage, discipline, and the ability to face death with no weapon in hand. It was a task that relied on the trust of the entire army and offered none of the protection granted to those doing the actual fighting. In a very literal sense, as a standard bearer was told, stand still, stand tall, and make yourself the biggest target in sight for as long as you can. Number 6, camp followers and field surgeons. While most attention in medieval warfare goes to knights, archers, and foot soldiers, some of the most dangerous and disturbing jobs were done by people far away from the front lines. Camp followers and field surgeons existed in a strange middle space. They weren't official combatants, but they operated in the direct shadow of war, exposed to its worst moments without the tools to defend themselves. Field surgery in the medieval period was primitive in the most literal sense. Surgeons didn't have proper sanitation practices, they had no understanding of germ theory, and they lacked almost every kind of pain control beyond alcohol or physical restraint. Their tools were iron and steel, bone saws, knives, and cauterizing irons heated over open flames. If a man came in with a shattered limb or an infected wound, the only reliable option was amputation, and that came with a high chance of the patient either bleeding out or dying later from infection. The process was performed quickly, sometimes in a tent near the battlefield, and often in conditions where dozens or even hundreds of other wounded men lay screaming nearby. Surgeons were expected to keep working without pause, triaging injuries under pressure while surrounded by blood, dirt, and desperation. These were not university-educated doctors, but often barbers, apprentices, or clerics who learned through repetition and sheer necessity. camp followers, meanwhile, were the invisible engine of the army, carrying supplies, cooking meals, tending fires, repairing clothing and armor, and cleaning up after battles. This last part was particularly grim. After the fighting ended, someone had to deal with the corpses, gather salvageable gear, and help the wounded. Raids on camps weren't rare, especially during sieges or retreats, and followers, many of whom were women and children, were often the first to suffer if an enemy broke through. These individuals had no armor, no weapons, and no formal protection. Their survival depended entirely on luck or the goodwill of soldiers who might themselves be exhausted, wounded, or traumatized. It's easy to overlook these roles in favor of more dramatic stories, but without them, armies would collapse quickly. They absorbed danger in a way that left no medals and rarely even records. Their contribution was essential, and their experience, especially the medics, was a constant brush with death, disease, and pain that few could endure for long. Number 7, the flank sacrifices. On the surface, the flanks of a medieval army might not seem like the worst place to be stationed. They weren't in the center where the general might expect the most brutal clashes, nor were they the elite vanguard absorbing the first wave. But the reality is much darker. Flanks were the soft spots, strategic blind zones where danger crept in first and help came last. These positions were typically filled with the lowest quality troops available: levied peasants, surplus militia, inexperienced recruits, or older veterans unfit for the center ranks. They were armed with whatever was on hand, often spears, axes, or even farming tools repurposed for war, and given minimal armor, if any at all. The reasoning behind this placement wasn't ignorance. Commanders knew full well what they were doing. The flank wasn't supposed to win, it was supposed to delay. The idea was simple and cruel. Keep the enemy busy on the sides just long enough for the center or reserve units to launch a decisive blow. That might work in theory, but for the men standing there, it meant facing highly mobile cavalry, flanking light infantry or shock troops without the training, discipline, or equipment to hold ground. In battle, the psychological strain alone could crush them. When they saw enemy units maneuvering toward them, they understood that they were not part of the winning move. They were bait. Even worse, some commanders intentionally allowed the flanks to collapse as a trap, encouraging the enemy to overextend before surrounding them with a reserve force. While that might win battles, it meant deliberately sacrificing a portion of the army, often without telling them. For the soldiers on the flank, survival became a matter of pure chance. If they ran, they risked being cut down from behind or punished afterward for cowardice. If they held, they were likely overwhelmed by better-equipped foes. In a medieval army that relied heavily on fear and hierarchy, being seen as weak could be fatal even if you lived through the fight. There was rarely any recognition for the men who stalled the enemy long enough to make the real maneuver possible. No songs, no names remembered, just the brutal understanding that their deaths were a tactical necessity. Even those few who survived weren't rewarded. They were just rotated back into the same position for the next battle. And unlike the knights or mercenaries who might have the means to retire or buy status, flank soldiers were almost always commoners with no way out. So when we talk about the scariest jobs in medieval warfare, the flank positions weren't just dangerous. They embodied the cold, disposable logic of feudal battle planning. These were the people thrown into harm's way, not by accident or misfortune, but by design. And that made their role not only terrifying, but deeply tragic.